Alright guys, so CNN seems to be in the midst of somewhat of an internal revolt from many of their different journalists and anchors over their warped coverage of Israel and Gaza and the, quote, double standards here, as pointed out by The Intercept's Daniel Boguslaw and Prem Thacker. And so I got a couple different things I want to get into here. We're going to talk about this article about this internal dispute that just recently happened at a high-level meeting at CNN. I'm also going to show you guys Fareed Zakaria, who is one of the guys who was listed in that article that we covered of who Joe Biden's favorite, news personalities are. He was on that list, and he's basically going to completely obliterate Biden's policy towards Israel. So we're going to circle back around to both of those things. But first, I just want to show you what it actually looks like to do real journalism and press, powerful officials around the world in the midst of what many people are, I think, accurately referring to as a genocide inside of Gaza. And so here we have Christiane Amanpour, who's on CNN International, which tends to be significantly better than CNN Domestic, where you have guys like Jake Tapper, previously Don Lemon as well, before he was pushed out, and guys like Anderson Cooper. CNNI tends to be better, and you're going to see why here in a second. So we got Christiane Amanpour. She's going to be interviewing this top Netanyahu advisor, Mark Regev, on the recent Flower massacre in Gaza, where in the northern portion of the Strip, Israel basically sent in a couple of aid trucks. A bunch of starving Palestinians went to go and try to get that aid, and then Israel opened fire and ended up killing over 100 of them. So let's go ahead and see how she handles this interview here.
Regev. As I said, there are disputed timelines. Either the shooting was first and then the stampede, or the stampede was first and then the shooting, but the facts are the facts. There are dead and injured. I think the first question, if you could answer, is who was this aid being driven in by or for? The UN and the normal, known aid agencies said that they had nothing to do with it. Do you know who it was?
I know the following, that in order to help alleviate the food shortage in Gaza, that we authorized in our convoy of, I think, some 30 trucks entered Gaza last night, headed for the northern Gaza Strip. And this shows that Israel is interested in seeing aid and foodstuffs reach the civilian population. Unfortunately, we saw a situation where there was a mass casualty tragedy, where it looked like the civilians were storming the trucks, trying to take the food out of desperation. And people, a crowd was pushing and shoving, and people were killed. I can't tell you the exact numbers. I don't, as you know, don't trust the numbers put out by the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health in Gaza. There were reports that maybe the drivers were driving over parts of the crowd. It appears to be a tragedy, but I can tell you Israel was not involved directly in any way.
Okay. When you say not involved directly in any way...
First off, I mean, she's going to press him on this, but Jesus Christ, man. Okay, a couple of different things here, right? First off, the video that's being shown right now, I don't know if this is the exact one that the IDF originally released, but it later came out that the video that the IDF released, this overhead drone footage, was heavily edited and conveniently edited out the points where Israel was firing on this group of people, which then caused a panic and then may have led to some of the deaths, a tiny minority of them, being from, trampling or a stampede, right? A vast majority of the deaths, according to all of the doctors' testimony who were receiving the patients who were wounded or killed from this massacre, were saying that the people were coming in with bullet wounds and shrapnel wounds. Okay, not from stampede injuries, right? So the idea that he is going to turn around and say that, oh, well, there was just a chaotic situation that unfortunately happened, it was a tragedy, but we had nothing to do with it. It was just these people who were trying to loot these trucks. I mean, first off, why do you think the people were desperately going up to these trucks in the way that they were? Could it have something to do with Israel blockading virtually all of the aid, over 70% by many estimates, of food and water and medical supplies from getting into Gaza, especially in the north, which has been basically flattened at this point by the IDF? I mean, could that have something to do with the desperation that was shown in this example? But he actually has the audacity to say, no, we had nothing to do with it. We had no involvement in this whatsoever. But let's see her pushback here, right?
Over parts of the crowd, it appears to be a tragedy, but I can tell you Israel was not involved directly in any way.
When you say not involved directly in any way, what do you mean? I mean, you enabled this convoy, as you said, and your forces are there on the ground and open fire. They said it themselves. What does that mean, not involved in any way?
So this was, we allowed the aid to come in. We were involved that way. That's our policy, to allow food to go into Gaza for the civilian population. But in the incident of people storming the trucks and the way the truck drivers behaved, and people getting squashed and pressed, and apparently there being mass casualties. Israel was not there on the ground.
Okay, but they did open fire and people were killed. So I'm completely confused by what you're saying, because they admitted, the IDF spokesman said it on our air, that they opened fire.
That's a separate incident.
Okay.
Not connected to the tragedy with the trucks. That was different place, different time, right, in the general location, but not the same incident at all. And all right, I have to tell you that we are not aware that the IDF caused casualties at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can tell you that a journalist who CNN works with on the ground has a different view of it, but maybe there were other incidents. That, obviously, you say is under review, and we will hope to get further clarification. But here's the thing.
Okay, so I'm going to skip forward to a different portion of this, but that's just amazing, right? Okay, I love how you can just hear her in the background being like, oh, right, okay, yeah, yeah, that's what happened, okay? He is actually trying to go with the narrative that not only did Israel not fire on these people, which is an easily disprovable lie, but they had nobody on the ground. That's what he just said. Israel had nobody on the ground there. What are you talking about? We have you on video. It's completely verifiable that you guys were on the ground there. Not only were you on the ground, but you fired on these people, and that resulted in a vast majority of the injuries and deaths as a result of this massacre coming from Israeli fire. That's not in dispute, guys. There's no ambiguity about this. It's all on record. We have the audio, we have the video, we have the testimony from the people on the ground who were attacked, we have the testimony from the doctors who treated the people who were attacked and killed. This is not even controversial. And as she pointed out there, he's actually even contradicting what the IDF admitted. The IDF admitted that they fired on these people. And then he says, oh, no, that was actually, that's a different thing. It had nothing to do with this. It was a totally different time, totally different place. What are you talking about? Are you saying it was a different place because it was 10 feet this way and maybe 5 seconds later? Is that what you mean by that? Because otherwise it's a complete lie. Okay, so the real situation of what happened here is they sent aid into the northern portion of Gaza in these convoys, and then they had no plan whatsoever for how to actually, like, in a coordinated way, distribute that aid. A bunch of starving Palestinians who are starving because Israel is starving them rushed these trucks desperately to try to get their hands on the aid. Israel then opens fire on them, and then the people start panicking and running away, and then maybe there were some injuries or deaths associated with the panic that ensued after that. But regardless of how you want to frame it, Israel is responsible for 100% of the casualties in this event, okay? So to try to dodge accountability on that is fucking crazy. It's absolutely insane, the gaslighting that so many of these Israeli politicians think that they can get away with. And this is what it looks like, again, when you have somebody who is actually doing their job, who is not just buying in to the easily disprovable bullshit propaganda coming from a lot of these Israeli officials. That's what it looks like when you actually have follow-up questions, basic follow-up questions like, you just said that Israeli forces didn't fire on them, but we have video evidence of them firing on them, and also the IDF admitted that they did. I mean, it's not that difficult, right? Or it shouldn't be that difficult. But she's doing a good job of, pushing back on his bullshit there. Now, I do want to skip forward here to another portion of this, if I can find it, where the interview, it gets even better from there. So let's go ahead and try to skip forward here.
So Jan Egeland says that when they take their trucks in, and he says, thankfully, theirs haven't been looted. He says they have a system, they have a delivery route, they have a distribution route, and they know what they're doing. He also said that they cannot move up north, that the Israeli checkpoints have prevented them from moving up north where the most dire situation is. We, CNN, have also conducted an investigation with all the geolocations and everything else, which show that Israel fired on an aid convoy February the 5th. So there is a lot of insecurity that most say are coming from you. He also said that Hamas has their food. That's in the tunnels, that's with them. It's got nothing to do with the civilians. So this is about civilians trying to receive aid. So these are facts. And when you say you want to take more aid in, I mean, seeing is believing. How is anybody meant to believe that you want it if it's not going in?
So it is going in, and more will be going in. That's our commitment. Do you think we have an interest in starvation in the Gaza?
Well, I don't know.
Of course we don't.
Okay. I don't know. I just don't understand it.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yes, they absolutely have an interest in starving the population of Gaza. I mean, this is no secret. You can obviously look at their tactics of blockading, upwards of over 70% of the aid from getting into Gaza, of allowing Israeli civilians to go to the border of Gaza and set up bouncy castles and handing out popcorn and candy to people who are protesting and blockading the aid from getting into Gaza. You can even look at Israeli, officials' statements and how they intentionally want to bleed out and starve the population of Gaza. This is not anything that's controversial, right? I mean, from the beginning of this offensive into Gaza, since October 7th, they openly admitted, yeah, we're going to cut off the food, the water, the fuel, the electricity, everything. It's a total siege, right? We're not going to allow anything to get in to Gaza. I mean, this is not a complex issue here, right? So he turns around and he says, no, what do you think? We're trying to starve the people of Gaza intentionally? Yeah, that's what I think, okay? And she says, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's, because she feels like she has a responsibility to say, I don't know, instead of just saying yes. But, that's probably the best that you could possibly ask for in terms of trying to hold one of these ghouls accountable. Now, we've had other journalists as well who I think have done a really good job in some of these interviews. Mehdi Hassan was one of them who I've talked about on this channel before. Obviously, he was pushed out from his job at MSNBC for daring to have tough interviews with guys like Mark Regev. So, it's obvious that broadly, the domestic media here in the United States, again, CNN is somewhat of its own thing, but domestically here in the United States, the mainstream outlets, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or CNN or whatever the case may be, overwhelmingly horrendous in their coverage so far. This is an example of, somebody actually doing their job pretty well, right? And so now we move on to this article again from The Intercept. In internal meeting, Christine Amanpour, the one we just watched, confronts CNN brass about double standards on Israel coverage. Okay, so they say, CNN employees, including the renowned international news anchor Christine Amanpour, confronted network executives over what the staffers described as a myriad of leadership failings in coverage of Israel's war on Gaza, according to a leaked recording of a recent all-hands meeting obtained by The Intercept. In the hour-long meeting at CNN's London bureau on the 13th of February, staffers took turns questioning a panel of executives about CNN's protocols for covering the war in Gaza and what they describe as a hostile climate for Arab reporters. Several junior and senior CNN employees described feeling devalued, embarrassed, and disgraced by CNN's war coverage. They say the panelists, CNN Worldwide CEO and CNN Editor-in-Chief Mark Thompson, CNN U.S. Executive Editor Virginia Mosley, and the International General Manager Mike McCarthy, responded with broad assurances that the employees' concerns were being heard. I'm sure they are, while also defending CNN's work and pointing to the persistent obstacle of gaining access inside the Gaza Strip. Now, I mean, to be fair, it is probably difficult to get access into the Gaza Strip. Why? Well, because Israel has killed more journalists throughout the last 5 months of their genocidal invasion of Gaza than in any other modern war in recent history, okay? You would have to go, even if you go back to World War II, the scale and the speed and the rate at which journalists have been killed in Gaza is not comparable. This is the amount of journalists who have been killed. It's over like 130 at this point. And in many cases, their families and themselves, the journalists themselves, have been specifically targeted and killed by Israel, right? Remember the Al Jazeera journalist, Wael Dadoo, I believe his name was. His whole family was killed, wiped out, because he dared to be on the ground telling the stories of Palestinians who are going through this genocidal war. So, of course, it's difficult to get into the Gaza Strip. Israel won't let you into the Gaza Strip without it being a direct threat to your life, right? And at this point, even wearing a press vest in Gaza is not a protection. In fact, it may even make you more so of a target, right? And so, of course, it's difficult. It's also difficult, just because Israel has massive censorship. If you want to go and do a ride-along with Israel, overwhelmingly, they're going to censor what kind of information you're able to get out, okay? And we've seen ride-alongs with specifically CNN going in with the IDF in certain circumstances. In some cases, they basically just because the IDF chose to do it directly in front of them and their cameras. Like we saw one example of them committing the war crime of destroying cemeteries in Gaza. And I talked about this, on the channel at the time. But it was just a ride-along with, I think it was like Jeremy Diamond or whatever his name is at CNN. And they were just like flattening cemeteries. And then they said, well, we had to destroy this cemetery because there's a Hamas tunnel that's running right underneath it. And then he was like, can I look at the tunnel? Can you give me evidence that there actually is an entrance to the tunnel that's inside the cemetery? And then they provided him drone footage. And then the drone footage, as CNN later pointed out, was showing two different entrances to a tunnel. We don't know what kind of tunnel it was, that were both outside of the cemetery. So, I mean, it's like, when you do let journalists into Gaza to do these ride-alongs, even with the IDF, it tends to come out very, embarrassing for the IDF and for Israel, to say the least, right? Or to be it makes them look bad to a large extent when you just openly commit war crimes on camera in front of these major international outlets, right? So of course it's difficult. No excuse to just be doing like rank Israeli propaganda, though. They continue saying that one issue that came up repeatedly is CNN's long-time process for routing almost all coverage relating to Israel and Palestine through the network's Jerusalem bureau. As The Intercept reported back in January, and I covered this as well, the protocol, which has existed for years but was expanded and rebranded as Second Eyes last summer, slows down reporting on Gaza and filters news about the war through journalists in Jerusalem who operate under the shadow of Israel's military censor. Okay, and we had a direct pushback on this prospect here from Amanpour. She said, "You've heard from me. You've heard from my, real distress with Second Eyes, changing copy, double standards, and all the rest." And she also said, "So you've heard it, and I hear what your response is, and I hope that it does go a long way." So I don't know if it will go a long way. Obviously, I mean, nothing drastically has changed in CNN's coverage of Gaza. Again, you have some journalists here and there who do phenomenal jobs. But overwhelmingly, I mean, it's been absurd, and they're going to show an example of that here in a second. They say, like other mainstream news organizations, CNN has faced a flood of internal and external criticism of its coverage of Israel and Gaza since October 7th, accused of minimizing Palestinian suffering and uncritically amplifying Israeli narratives. Just this week, CNN described an Israeli massacre, the Flower Massacre, of more than 100 starving people who were gathered to get food as a chaotic incident. A chaotic incident, not a massacre, a chaotic incident. And earlier this month, The Guardian published an extensive story sourced to multiple CNN staffers who described the network's Gaza coverage as journalistic malpractice. That's coming from people who work at CNN. They say during the February meeting, a half-dozen staffers spoke candidly about concerns with CNN's war coverage. They said that the coverage has weakened the network's standing in the region and has led Arab staffers, some of whom entered lethal situations to cover the war, feeling as though their lives are expendable. One saying, "I was in southern Lebanon during October and November, and it was more distressing for me to turn on CNN than for the bombs that were falling nearby." So, again, to call this an internal revolt might even be underplaying it, right? I mean, these journalists, many of whom do directly risk their lives to report on this stuff, they feel completely abandoned by CNN because of how warped their coverage is in a pro-Israeli direction. I mean, when you're filtering your coverage through the Jerusalem bureau under the shadow of an IDF censor, what do you think that does to your coverage? Do you think maybe it might have, I don't know, somewhat of a bias towards it? In one way, shape, or form? No, maybe not. I mean, it's just, at this point, it's utterly absurd. And so I'm glad that, people like Christine Amanpour, who is obviously a massive figure at CNN and has been for years, I'm glad that she's speaking up, because something's got to change, right? Now, granted, even with all of the criticism that we have seen from CNN journalists behind the scenes and anchors and all of the propaganda that we've seen from many mainstream outlets who are trying to do cover for Israel and their genocidal war on Gaza, even with all of that, the American people overwhelmingly still want a ceasefire. They're not buying in to all of the propaganda that we saw, like in this interview with Mark Regev. So, I mean, imagine what the foreign policy prospects for the United States of America, or the American people's views on U.S. foreign policy. Imagine what that would look like if we actually had an honest media that was willing to confront power like Christine Amanpour was doing here, or was willing to call out Biden in the way that Fareed Zakaria is going to do here. So let's just go ahead and jump into this clip real quick. I'm just going to play a couple of minutes here where, and keep in mind, this is one of the people who Joe Biden said was, one of his favorite journalists, right? This is one of the main guys, if he's watching CNN, that he's going to listen to. And here was Fareed Zakaria's analysis of Joe Biden's handling of Israel and Gaza so far.
Here's my take. When Hamas launched its gruesome terror attack on Israel on October 7th of last year, President Biden made a decision based on conviction and calculation. He announced his complete solidarity with the country. Biden must have calculated that the only way to have any influence on Israel would be to hug it close, show real empathy, send it the arms it needed, and thus earn Israel's trust to shape its response. It was a thought-through strategy, but it has failed almost completely. From the start, the administration urged the Israelis to consider proportionality in their response to Hamas. Israel heard it and went ahead with one of the most extensive bombing campaigns in this century against a population of about 2.2 million people that by Israel's own estimates contained about 30,000 Hamas militants. By one January estimate, more than half of buildings across Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The administration counseled Israel against a large ground invasion of Gaza, advising it to take a narrower, targeted approach aimed at eliminating Hamas militants and infrastructure. The Israeli government had lots of long meetings with U.S. officials and then again went ahead with the ground invasion. The Biden team urged a humanitarian pause, but only got a brief one when it was able to get the government of Qatar to broker a hostage exchange. After initial operations wound up, American officials told Israeli officials that what was done in the north of Gaza could not be done to the south. Yet, after telling people to move to the south to get out of harm's way, Israel then proceeded to bomb the south in a manner that President Biden himself admitted is indiscriminate. The U.S. has repeatedly pressured Israel to make greater efforts to protect innocent civilians, but to little avail. Now it has been counseling against an invasion of Rafah, the city nestled close to Egypt, where over 1 million Palestinians have huddled together. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has promised to invade Rafah, whether another hostage deal is made or not. Washington has warned that after the war, there should be no Israeli seizure of land in Gaza and no new Israeli occupation of the territory. The Israeli government's plans are to do both. The result is that American policy on the Gaza war now appears hapless, ineffective, and immoral.
Hapless, ineffective, and immoral. This is one of Joe Biden's supposed favorite journalists, who is calling him hapless, ineffective, and immoral. And he's 100% correct. I mean, what it comes down to, all of the different, he did a good job there detailing sort of like the last couple of months of U.S. foreign policy, officials basically coming out, wagging their finger at Israel and saying, no, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Biden coming out and saying, it's indiscriminate bombing. And then at the same time as they have these critiques of Israel's strategy, they don't use any of the leverage that they have at their disposal in order to actually force Israel to end the campaign or to change their offensive strategy, right? If anything, they're doing the opposite of that. Joe Biden was trying to push forward with $14 billion on top of the already $3.8 billion that we give them on an annual basis, and that aid that we were going to give them would have no congressional oversight whatsoever. No strings attached whatsoever, that Israel has to abide by international law when using those weapons, which they obviously are not. But Joe Biden is just not willing to use any leverage whatsoever to pressure Israel. And so you're left with one of two conclusions, right? Either number one, he is completely incompetent and delusional and genuinely believes that wagging your finger behind the scenes is going to get Netanyahu to stop what he's doing. Or the second option is that he just agrees with what Israel's doing. And that may be my biggest disagreement there with what Fareed had to say. Because he characterizes it as listen, Joe Biden went into this with a good faith approach of, well, maybe if we hug Netanyahu as close as possible, then he'll listen to us behind the scenes. I don't know how you could possibly come away with that conclusion. Okay, Netanyahu doesn't even like Biden. Netanyahu wants Donald Trump to win the 2024 election. He's perfectly happy to even sabotage Biden's political aspirations right now if it helps him in some way, shape, or form. So the idea that you're going to risk your own reelection, you're going to sacrifice the lives of tens of thousands of innocent people, and meanwhile completely torch your own base here in the United States domestically and politically, the idea that you're going to do that for what? For what exactly? And honestly, I do think that makes me think that it is much more that Joe Biden just agrees with what Israel is doing. Because otherwise, how do you not use the bully pulpit? How do you not leverage weapons over Israel to get them to stop? It's not that difficult. We've seen previous presidents throughout American history. Reagan is a good example back from the 80s, where he got on the phone with, at the time it was Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel. And they were bombing the shit out of Lebanon, and Reagan called him up on the phone. He called it a Holocaust. He used that word. And he said, y'all got to cut this out. 20 minutes later, he gets a call back from the prime minister. Okay, we're pulling out. We're halting the bombing. We're pulling out. 20 minutes. Now you may say, oh, well, the dynamics are not exactly as they were back in the 1980s. Sure. But do you really think that the president of the United States Israel's closest ally, the country that has been vetoing multiple different ceasefire resolutions at the United Nations Security Council, the country that has been giving them complete diplomatic cover for every single crime that they commit, the country that gives them billions of dollars in aid and weaponry on an annual basis. You really think that country has no leverage over Israel whatsoever? That Biden has no leverage to pressure Israel into doing what he sees fit? I mean, if you believe that, then I don't really know what to tell you. So, I mean, it's definitely interesting to see that these dynamics are playing out, even in these mainstream outlets, who I have many, many different criticisms for. But at least you do have some voices who are speaking up and recognize how absolutely insane and barbaric the current situation is.